Hey everybody, video here for you today. We're going to be talking about an ancient site in Jordan, some ancient text, a possible cosmic catastrophe that happened right down here. This is just northeast of the Dead Sea. We're going to be joined by a special guest, but this is tall el-Hammam right down here. Here's a look at this ancient mound. I've talked a lot about sites like this on my channel. This is about 14 miles due east of Jericho. I found that very interesting in this site. Archaeological work here started about 15 years ago, so this is pretty new information. Dr. Stephen Collins was the one who led the archaeological work here. Here are some look at the ruins. A clear black level, something very bad, very hot happened here, and this heat was not produced by natural processes from these people. Evidence of a cosmic event here. Some more looks at the archaeological work, a victim here. But I thought this was very interesting. This is very new work. Considered when you look at the whole aspect of ancient history archaeological work in this area. Some more look. Here is a clear burnt layer. Here is a look from the top of the tell. This place had never been excavated before until pretty recently. Some more looks at the archaeological work. Some burnt fragments of whatever in here. High heat produced this level. And here is George Howard. He did work here. I'm sure a lot of you have seen him on with Ben or Randall Carlson. He was here in 2014. I believe this is a jug handle he is holding up right here. So why don't we talk to George, since he had a first-hand perspective of this ancient site. All right, everybody, we're joined now by George Howard, author of the Cosmic Tusk. I really appreciate you joining me today, George.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Chuck. CFAP 7865. It's good to be with you in person, buddy. I've been a big fan for several years. And
thank you very much.
A lot of people around the world have watched hundreds of your videos.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's just been quite the long, strange trip it's been over 9 years, that's for sure. Now, I've asked Brian Forrester and Ben and Scott Walter this. What got you interested in these ancient mysteries, ancient impacts, stuff like that?
Yeah, it goes well. I grew up kind of an archaeology geek. My mother went on digs, and my father did a whole lot of business in the Middle East. So I went over there as a child. So I had a natural history and a natural interest in ancient history. But then I actually got involved with it through my work in discovering the phenomenon of Carolina bays in the early 90s, and kind of became connected with that around 95 or 96 and put some stuff up on the internet in the early days, and that has persisted as a great subject of inquiry for me. But it also expanded into a lot of other things, included the Younger Dryas event, which I know you and your viewers are familiar with, and then even other subparts of that, like we'll discuss today, which is subsequent impacts in the Holocene.
Yes, I've made some videos on many impacts, maybe one in Egypt happening around the end of the Old Kingdom, the Sudbury event, I believe it is called. A few other possible impact sites in Canada, just something I've been fascinated with, because the more I looked into history, I realized that we have been affected by cosmic events a lot more than we realize.
That's right. And I think a lot of the people that are really getting into the Younger Dryas event, which is terrific, you know, have a lot more to explore. That what happens is you start to realize that since then, there have been very significant events of varying degrees of magnitude since. Some that we wouldn't want to happen today that weren't as bad as the Younger Dryas event, but would disturb things quite greatly today if they were to happen again. And a lot of those were relatively recent compared to 13,000 years ago for the YD.
Well, the Younger Dryas, for me, when I really took in the magnitude of what happened, it just seemed so important. This event that just happened 12,000 years ago, or a couple different periods. I mean, that's not like 65 million years ago, like the dinosaurs. This is something that happened just in the blink of an eye ago, as far as the geological record.
That's exactly the way I think of it. And you know, the dinosaur comet killer is fascinating. But you know, deep time like that, 65 million years, it really might have just happened on another planet entirely.
Exactly.
From a practical standpoint, you know, compared to something that was only 13,000 ago.
All right, before we get into the subject of today, I just want to ask you one brief question. How did the trip to Egypt change you? Did that really affect you deeply as far as looking at ancient mysteries?
It did, and it actually affected kind of my view towards current events. that it made me realize again, things are so unstable now to show that great civilizations and great peoples can come and go. And they have come and gone and come and gone and come and gone in Egypt. And I just hope that here we maintain some of the continuity that they maintained there despite a lot of disruption.
All right, the subject of today, Tal el-Hammam. I
That's
hope I
right.
said that right.
Yes,
Now,
sir.
what got you interested in this place in Jordan? And you went there in 2014, I believe, originally, and did archaeological work there. I think that's great.
Yeah.
Just tell how you got interested in that and why you did that research.
Yeah, I went in 2014 and 2015. And I was actually contacted by a gentleman, an English gentleman, an older catastrophist, who sent me an email and said, hey, there is a dig team in Jordan that has found the largest city of the Levant, the largest city of Israel and Jordan and the Jordan Valley. And they believe that it exhibits signs of a catastrophe and a cosmic catastrophe, but they are not skilled in these determinations. Would your team be interested in talking to them? And at the same time, they, as one of those kind of coincidental things, they were also put in touch with one of the YD team authors and credentialed scientists, unlike myself, Dr. Robert Hermes. I believe he's out there in New Mexico, I believe Sandia or something like that. And so we had two lines of communication with them that kind of bolstered each other. And the team leaders, Dr. West and Dr. LeCompte and Dr. Bunch and some of the others, evaluated the opportunity to go over there and see whether we could add something to their investigation and use the forensic techniques of the YD team to perhaps show that the evidence was very strong that there was an impact there. So I took the opportunity to be the first one over there. So in 2014, I went over there alone and dug some. I did the real work of being down on my hands and knees, and did that about half the time. But I was lucky because kind of the other half of the time I could go walkabout, which was nice to get off your knees and to knock the dust off. But it also meant walking alone through a lot of Bedouin fields in the Jordan Valley, which was an unusual experience, but one I treasured.
Well, one of the first things I noticed about that when you kind of clued me into that site and said, hey, you might want to check this out, I noticed that it was about 14 miles almost directly east of Jericho. And I had done a video fairly recently on Jericho, so that got me very interested.
Yeah.
And just this tell, it appeared a lot like the Jericho tell, maybe just a bit smaller, but it just didn't appear to be excavated at all.
Right.
And this work that Dr. Stephen Collins was ahead of, this is very new work.
Yeah.
Generally. And I know he applied to get a permit to excavate there for 4 years. And then finally on the 5th year, he got this permission to dig there. So
That's
this
right.
is all pretty much new research, right?
Yeah, it's all in the last 15 years, but they're 15, 16 seasons into it now. So it's a very, very mature dig and has had a lot of outside experts come in and lend a lot of support to it. So it is new to the archaeology scene in that many sites have been investigated for decades. This one hasn't, but over the last decade and a half, the investigation has been very intensive and comprehensive.
Now, people are trying to attach this to Sodom of the Bible, and when I hear these things, I take it with a huge grain of salt. But Stephen Collins, Dr. Stephen Collins, I believe he's from Veritas University.
Trinity Southwest.
Okay. But his work really impressed me, just the way he put all these pieces together. And there's a lot of clues in the Bible as far as the location of Sodom. And this is a site that I had never heard attached to it.
Right.
But just the way he put it together. And I think I'll attach a video link of him explaining how he got into this, because I just thought that was very well explained. But could you just talk a little bit about Dr. Stephen Collins?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. I tell you, I think he's, without question, in my opinion, as a fan of archaeology, he's one of the greatest living archaeologists. And he demonstrates that best because he's probably not one of the best known. Now, he's certainly known in the circles of Middle Eastern archaeology, but I think his reputation is only going to grow in coming years because he has discovered something quite extraordinary. And he did it on his own with grit and determination and intuition and using the scientific method, despite being a man of faith. he was perhaps first faithful to the scientific method, so that he could see whether he could tease out whether some of some of the Bible truths. And I'm not a particularly faithful man. I'm a little bit more than just a Christmas and Easter Episcopalian, but I'm certainly not a Bible literalist, you know, and I probably haven't read the book as thoroughly as I have. But it lent a lot to my personal faith. I had no idea until I got over there and saw the evidence that some of these apocryphal stories from the Old Testament were so clearly true, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And the way Dr. Collins was able to look at the actual geography of the Bible and the place names and the directions, and able to map out literally where it should be, and then went to the location and discovered the largest city of Levant. And I'll add, it's actually was 10 times larger than Jericho in its day.
Oh, really? Wow.
10 times, and 100 times larger than Jerusalem. Right.
And
it was without question the largest city at that time.
Now, from what I heard, that maybe archaeology wasn't even possible at this site till the early 2000s, because there was actually, this was in a military zone and there was landmines directly on the site even.
Chuck, you have done your homework. That's exactly right. It was well mined, and people stayed off of it. There was, I think, just a little bit of surface collection, and as they often do, just as they did at Göbekli Tepe, there was a little bit of surface collection, probably nervous collection in terms of those mines, and they determined it was Byzantine and walked away. And it just didn't get the look that it should have. And then Collins, you know, went a little deeper, as archaeologists do, and discovered a wonderful, huge city.
I will share some pics at the end of this video on the stuff that we talk about, but I was very impressed by the ruins and just the fact that nobody had ever dug there. That had to be exciting to work there.
Yeah, no, and you bring up a good point. The fact that it's directly across from Jericho, mm-hmm. and just the siting of the whole thing, there's almost kind of a sacred geography in it. I know that sometimes we use the term sacred geometry, but it's perfectly equidistant from and parallel to where Jericho is. Mm-hmm. And Jericho sits down hundreds of feet down in the Dead Sea Valley, in the Jordan Valley. And then up at the top of Jericho, when you drive up the hills and go, about 15 miles, up and a little bit south, you come to Jerusalem. So what it was is Jerusalem was the city at the top of the hill, and this was the suburb, if you will, maybe the distant, maybe almost the vacation place, mm-hmm. down, because the climate's quite different there. Down in the valley. The same thing works at Tel el-Hammam with Amman, the capital of Jordan, that it is at the top of the hill. The drive from Amman to Tel el-Hammam is just like the drive from Jerusalem to Jericho. And then to top it all off, directly between Jericho and Tel el-Hammam is the Jordan River itself, which is fascinating, but also the supposed baptismal site of Jesus himself by John. Mm-hmm. So there's just a lot of symmetry around the area, and it's been inhabited for years and years and years. And perhaps one of the most exciting things about the place is it's got the best second act of all time, if it were Sodom, and I believe it is. 700 years later, it has never been disputed by people that believe that the Exodus, it set the Exodus as a historical event, mm-hmm. Or even mythological, I suppose. It still pointed to that same place where Tel el-Hammam was the last campsite of the Israelites. And when you look over your shoulder, Jericho's one way. When you look back over your shoulder is Mount Nebo. And mm-hmm. you see where Moses looked down on the promised land, and Tel el-Hammam was the promised land. And that's where they set up the last encampment of the Israelites. Obviously, Moses never made it down the hill, but that's where they sent Joshua over to raid Jericho. So if it be true, the Ark of the Covenant once sat on Tel el-Hammam, but that is the secondary story to what we're investigating here. So what a great second act to have been Sodom. And then it was complete no man's land for 700 years. And that's true archaeologically, and also based off of what we know of, recordings of the time, that it was considered a wasteland, and for good reason, that people were, feared that something horrible would happen there. And it also was destroyed by salt. there's a huge saline concentration at the burn layer at el-Hammam. So
That's what I
whatever burned it and melted it also salted it, and it made it inappropriate for agriculture for at least 700 years.
That's what I found very interesting, just because if you know your Genesis, it says that the fire and brimstone or whatever
Right.
killed all the inhabitants of the area, but it does say, and the vegetation.
Yeah.
And the vegetation didn't grow for centuries.
It did not grow for centuries, and we suspect that's because the airburst that occurred, frankly, it would have blown the Dead Sea out of its depression and up into the valley and covered everything with some of the most saline water on Earth.
I believe the numbers are 12,800 parts per million of salt prevents wheat to grow. 17,900 parts per million prevents barley to grow.
Yeah.
And the amount of salt far exceeded those levels.
It sure did. It sure did. So it took hundreds and hundreds of years for what is a very fertile place. And people should keep this in mind, that that's a big part of the story and too much for us to go in now. But that Abraham, or the Bible in Genesis, refer to it as a well-watered land, just as in Egypt.
Like the garden in Egypt, yes.
That's right. And really what that is, it's the same thing as the Nile Delta, which runs south to north and spreads out into a beautiful fertile area. This is the reverse on a smaller scale. It's the river coming down, opening up into, it's no longer a delta like it once was, but opening up in a delta before it goes in the Dead Sea, and that's referred to as the Kakar. And that is a very, very fertile place to this day. They grow some of the greatest produce in the Middle East, for instance. You know, there are greenhouses everywhere and farm fields with produce. And it's just a good place to live after you've outlived that salt period.
But it makes total sense that an airburst in the Dead Sea and the salt, I mean, that seems to be really a viable explanation for the whole area being barren for centuries.
That's right. That's right.
That is very interesting. Now, this place dates, they say, 2,500 years of occupation before this event happened.
That's right. Yeah, it goes all the way back to the Chalcolithic period, the earliest inhabitants of the area that are well accepted. Yeah.
Do you think, as research goes on, it could be dated even farther back, since Jericho dates 8,900?
It's a great question, Chuck, and I've never put that to Dr. Collins, but I've wondered myself. They're obviously concentrated on, there's such a large area there, and just like any archaeologist, they got to deal with a small part of it. And they've gone quite deep, but they're not concentrating on, I think they're concentrating on getting, down to that 2000 BC level, right? And doing as much of that as they can without trying to characterize those earlier civilizations.
I believe when I first looked at it on Google Earth, I think it measured about 1/3 of a mile long, the tell. Yeah. Is that about accurate?
Yeah.
But one of the first things I noticed, I just said, hey, this isn't the only site. I noticed, just my mind and my eye on Google Earth, I saw about 3 other sites right in the general area. And then I remember Stephen Collins talking about the other sites that are pretty much undocumented right now.
That's right. And of course, people might be curious. There is Gomorrah. You can see from the top of the tall, you can see what is Gomorrah, which I believe is Tel Kafrin, okay, in its modern name. And again, we don't have the time to go into it, and I'm probably, certainly not as skilled as Dr. Collins in explaining why. But he did a deductive process. He didn't decide that. First of all, he said this is where it should be based off the biblical geography, and then he was confronted with, I think, was 13, maybe 17 different talls there, and it ended up that this one was the largest, and it had a companion just down the way, which presumably would have been Gomorrah.
And it being the largest by quite a bit, I mean, that's a great clue that it was Sodom of the Bible.
Yeah, it was the dominant city, but you can see this was such a lush place that people could live just about anywhere in it, but people being people, unlike our current condition, like to gather together. So there were a number of clusters of places that probably persisted over millennia out there, and most of them just being now just cultural hills. And obviously, everything that you see that's above a certain elevation is all cultural. It's all been brought in. Now, there was a spine under el-Hammam that they first settled that would have been natural geological feature. But then all that, thousands and thousands of cubic yards of dirt and material and whatnot are successive building practices and mud bricks and whatnot. Yeah.
Now I'm going to show some pics here after our talk of some clearly defined black layers.
Yeah.
And I assume that is from that specific area that you were investigating the impact?
Yeah, you go down, Chuck, I should have it on the tip of my tongue, but I think you go down 3 meters, roughly 3 meters, and the character of the cultural soils changes entirely. First of all, it becomes sterile. Well, there's actually a sterile period after it for, like I said, 700 years. But below that, there's an area of ash. And you can actually still faintly smell it and get a feeling that this is different. This is burnt land. And by burnt, I mean burnt. Okay, that some of the artifacts that we're finding in that layer were heated up to, wrote it down earlier, had to, 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right.
You know, that is very, very hot and much hotter than you're going to get in any kind of, thatched hut fire or kitchen fire, or even the village catches on fire. The temperatures exceeded those kinds of regular fires by orders of magnitude. And that's very clear both visually and also when you look at it forensically.
One of the things I read that I thought was very interesting is you had some pottery fragments where just one side of it had melted slightly into glass, and that was indicative of just a millisecond quick air burst with the temperatures going 8 to 12,000 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, that's right.
There was even evidence of a quick event where just something came through with incredibly high temperatures.
That's right. And everything was blown down, to put it mildly, in one direction.
In one direction. That's
right.
Important.
So if you had a regular fire, why would all the walls just fall one way? Why would things be covered on just one side? I guess I could imagine that with a fire. But all of the indications taken together show that there was a violent, superheated event that came from one direction, and that includes the human remains. And a lot of that hadn't been published yet, but there's an upcoming paper that I know I've discussed with you that's under review now, and obviously should be very controversial, but it's also so very well done that this is now going on the 5th year of working on assembling the proper evidence to make what's an extraordinary claim, support it with extraordinary evidence, as people always say. I'm actually not a big fan of that phrase, so I hate to repeat that meme. But these days, if you got to play the game and you've got a wild claim, you better come up with some very good stuff. And the paper that's under development or in review actually is an extraordinary piece of scholarship, and will nail it to anyone that isn't hopelessly biased against something like this. And there are a number of reasons to be biased. Not only they're illegitimate reasons, but not only do you have the natural uniformitarian bias against such things, my gosh, then Tell el-Hammam has a whole biblical archaeology bias against it.
Right.
Are these people just out to prove their book at any cost to science, which I know from my heart and by personal experience that these people are scientists first when they're doing their work, and people of faith outside of their science. And they're extraordinary people too. They're just the feel of the workers on this. It's not an academic exercise. It's an exercise of love, clearly.
Mm-hmm. I think we both kind of have the same general viewpoint of biblical text and where it fits into real history.
Right.
Now, this is something I started investigating, and I just didn't care about it. I was totally, not biased, just no agenda.
Yeah.
And it was very clear to me that some biblical events are written off of real events.
Right.
And then the power of God is thrown into it. And
that's right.
Then it kind of changes into this religious story, but a lot of them have basis and foundations in real stories that actually happened. Some of these stories are based on direct events in the fire and brimstone. I have mentioned it in sulfur. I think that's an important thing to bring up too. I mentioned it once in a video, I think, but I just found this whole fascinating topic of Tell el-Hammam just super interesting.
Well, you've got to hand it to the biblical archaeologists like Collins that in a way they're running against the people who are faithful without evidence, right? Now he's faithful first, but he's, of what actually happened there, come what may. And I heard an interview with him just the other day when I was kind of brushing back up on things, where he so clearly delineated if it wasn't there, for instance, he wasn't going to try to force it to be there, right?
Mm-hmm.
That he followed the evidence and it supported it. But think of then people of faith, maybe they don't want to know, at least some elements of them, to know that it was a fragment of a comet and it wasn't just the hand of God.
Right.
So what people like him are doing, you know, from some other people's perspective could be, I wouldn't say undermining the Bible, but they're adding something to it other than just pure blind faith.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so you got to hand it to them. You know, now did God through the comet? That's another matter. Right. But he's trying to, you know, he's not trying to find the hand of God. He's trying to find the scientific evidentiary results of normal physics, which this is an extraordinary event, but all governed by normal physics and nothing metaphysical about it.
The locations in the Old Testament, I did a video on Eden and how clearly Genesis concentrates around the area around Haran, Adam, Aram, and that is the area around that area. I mean, the geological, you know, little clues in the Bible, I mean, you can take those and plug those into real sites and real history. And I just think
exactly Colin's approach. The geography of the Bible is extensive. If they're telling myth, they give you myth with a roadmap of actual places.
And just the verse in Genesis where he is between or at Bethel and Ai and looking clearly, he's looking east.
Right.
And really what I heard from Dr. Stephen Collins really convinced me that Sodom was definitely northeast of the Dead Sea, not south where I had heard in old videos. And but he gave me a whole new way to look at it, and I really appreciate you turning me on to his research.
Well, it's funny, the biblical archaeologists shot themselves in the foot because they had a guy, I think his name was F.W. Albrecht, and he was I believe a Midwestern, you know, fundamentalist and whatnot, starch-collared early 20th century guy. But he was apparently dominant in the field, and what he said went. And he said, for reasons that that are still unknown, you know, how he got there, from what I understand, he said it was south of the Dead Sea. So all the faithful Christians, being, you know, his flock, they stuck with south of the Dead Sea now, and there are many out there that you would ask, well, it's, you know, it's south of the Dead Sea. I learned that growing up. Collins didn't take that. He didn't take that was received wisdom. You know, it wasn't evidence-based wisdom. So he said, let me look at this text and see if it gives me geographic clues without any respect to what Albright said. And then what will I find if I go to that place? And it's a wonderful story. And he's got a terrific book that was published about 4 or 5 years ago that's still available with a major imprint. I think it's Doubleday or something. And it's just a great book that explains the whole thing. And there's only been more that's happened since that book.
Well, I think it's a fascinating subject, and the fact that people didn't live there for 7 centuries after this horrific event happened, where the Iron Age is right on top of the Bronze Age, there's no occupation. It just, everything adds up to a pretty catastrophic event in the area, I think.
That's right. And then 700 years later, the first people to settle back down were Moses and the Israelites.
Yep. Well, that
amazes me.
Yep, that's all debatable, but the Bible is pretty clear on these locations.
Yeah.
And I just think this is a fascinating site, and the fact that the high levels of heat, the directional, all the buildings fell certainly in a directional way based on what I've read. I mean, if a place is sacked and burned and buildings are destroyed, everything's just in a big jumble. It's not in a directional.
Yeah.
You know? So I just think this is a fascinating subject, and I really envy you for going there and digging an archaeological site and sharing the pics with me. I'm going to share these at the end, and I'll show that burnt layer and a few of the other things we talked about. I just learned a whole bunch on this, George, and I really appreciate it.
Well, Chuck, I'm glad you're publicizing it and popularizing it, because Tell el-Hammam has gotten a significant amount of attention. But to anybody that gets fascinated about this, it doesn't seem like enough. I mean, they do get covered by the archaeological magazines, and some of the early reports, published reports, resulted in worldwide news. So it has gotten some attention, but I think it's only going to grow over time. And I think Collins' reputation as a brave man of science is only going to grow as the dig continues to uncover very, very clear evidence that the Bible's more than a myth.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly learned a lot, and I think cosmic catastrophes could be plugged into many periods in history, not just the Younger Dryas, and not just I just think it's a brand new subject that we are just kind of getting grips on.
Well, you're doing a good job getting it out there, and it's going to get more smart people like yourself and other people that get into this are going to continue to turn up, and popularize more of these ideas so that we can discuss them and debate them, and not just sweep them under the rug like a lot of catastrophist interpretations have been in the past. So thank you, Chuck.
Yep. Do you ever think you're going to go back? Do you have plans to go back there ever? Or?
I want to go back maybe with my family or something. I don't know if I want to put on the knee pads and get out the toothbrush again, or do any the walking around the valley,
right.
Getting chased by dogs and whatnot. But I'd like to take my family to Israel, and I'd like to go across the border. There's a border crossing nearby there, and that could be a little complex, but go across there and get the guides that work on that thing, that work on the dig, and take us around and actually show my family what was going on over there. Because again, it's just a stunning thing. You sit up at the top or stand up at the top of Tel el-Hammam and look out, and you see Jericho from one direction. You can see the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem just barely.
Oh, really?
You can see the glint of the gold of the Dome of the Rock without any other thing from the city, but you can just see that little golden glint. And then you see the Dead Sea laid out there, just flat as a board at the lowest place on earth. And when you're at the top of the tall, you're 800 feet below sea level.
That's pretty incredible.
It is. It's an extraordinary place, and I'd love to go back. And I encourage anybody that's doing, if you ever go to Petra, you can go to Tel el-Hammam. It's actually a lot closer and easier to get to from Amman. So if anyone's in Jordan doing any kind of travel or exploring, it's a don't miss thing.
Well, George, I really appreciate it. This fits in really well with some of my research lately on these ancient tells that go way back in history. And this is a site I investigate a lot. I had never heard about it until you mentioned it to me, and I just thought it was perfect for my channel, and I appreciate you talking with me today.
Well, that's great. It's better days are ahead of it when that paper comes out, and you're way ahead of the curve, Chuck. So thank you for inviting me on and all the great work that you did.
All right. I'm looking forward to playing golf with you here in Vegas, and we'll just wrap it up right there.
We're going to do it, buddy.
All right.
Okay.
You take care.
See ya.